Chapter 1. The missing piece. Scott Benson stared at the blinking cursor on his laptop like it had personally offended him. The marketing report was done, polished, and ready to impress the regional VP, but he couldn't bring himself to hit send. Not because he doubted the work. He was good at his job. Great, even. People said so. His boss said so. His LinkedIn endorsements practically threw confetti at him. So why did he feel like someone had swapped his champagne for flat soda? He leaned back in his ergonomic chair, the kind that promised lumbar nirvana, and rubbed his temples. 34 years old, single, successful, and living in a city where brunch was considered a competitive sport. He had everything he thought he wanted. Except something was missing. He couldn't name it, but it was there, like a faint itch under the skin. His phone buzzed. Grandpa Mark. Of course. Scott answered with a smile. Hey, old man. Watch it. Mark's gravelly voice shot back. I can still outrun you. Scott chuckled. Sure, if the race is from the recliner to the fridge. Don't tempt me. I've been training with commercial breaks. Mark paused, then added, You sound tired. I'm fine, Scott lied. Just work stuff? Work stuff. Mark repeated, like it was code for existential crisis. You know, when I was your age, I was halfway around the world dodging typhoons and Navy cooks who thought powdered eggs were a food group. Scott smiled. Different times. Same principle, Mark said. You're drifting, Scotty. You need a course correction. Scott opened his mouth to argue, but Mark steamrolled ahead. Come home for a while. The house needs work, and I need someone young enough to climb a ladder without filing a will first. Scott hesitated. He loved that house, the wraparound porch, the turret that made it look like a castle, the smell of old wood and history. But quitting his job? Walking away from the life he'd built? Think about it, Mark said, softer now. You've been running full throttle since college. Maybe it's time to idle for a bit. Scott promised he'd think about it, hung up, and stared at the cursor again. For the first time in years, the idea of slowing down didn't sound like failure. It sounded like relief. 2 weeks later, Scott sat across from Tammy in a dimly lit restaurant, wondering how he'd missed the warning signs. She was beautiful, polished, and currently scrolling through her phone like he was an inconvenient side dish. So, she said, without looking up, when do I meet your grandfather? Scott blinked. Why? Tammy finally glanced at him, her expression a mix of impatience and lip gloss. Because it's the next logical step. Meet the future in-laws before we get married. Scott nearly choked on his water. Married? Well, eventually, she said, waving a manicured hand. Isn't that where this is headed? Scott stared at her. They'd been together for 2.5 years, and in all that time, she'd never asked about his childhood, his favorite movie, or, he tested the theory, what's my middle name? Tammy frowned. You never told me. My birthday. She shrugged. You're a fall baby? Scott set down his glass. Name one thing about me that someone in love should know. Tammy's silence was deafening. He didn't yell, didn't make a scene, just smiled, a tired, sad smile, and said, I think we're done. She sputtered excuses, tried to spin it, but Scott had already paid the check and walked out. The night air felt like freedom. Months passed. Without Tammy as a distraction, Scott had time to think. Too much time, maybe. He worked, he jogged, he ate takeout alone. And every night, his phone lit up with Mark's voice, teasing, advising, nudging. Finally, Scott made the call. I'm coming home. Mark didn't cheer. Mark didn't do sentimental out loud, but Scott could hear the grin in his voice. About damn time. The day Scott pulled into the long driveway, he felt like he'd stepped into a sepia photograph. The colonial house loomed ahead, regal and tired, its turret crowned with the U.S. flag and the Navy flag beneath. The wraparound porch sagged a little, like it had been holding its breath for years. Mark stood on the porch, arms crossed, wearing a flannel shirt and the smug expression of a man who'd won a bet no one else knew about. You look like a city boy, Mark said as Scott climbed out of the car. We'll fix that. Scott grinned. Good to see you too. Inside, the house smelled like home, wood polish, old books, and a hint of pipe tobacco. The library was just as Scott remembered, mahogany panels, bay window, and Mark's shrine of naval memorabilia. The USS Constitution model gleamed under glass, a testament to Mark's stubbornness and toothpick engineering. You've been busy, Scott said, eyeing a new butterfly display. Gotta keep the mind sharp, Mark replied. Unlike yours, which has been dulled by PowerPoint slides. Scott laughed, but the truth stung a little. He'd been living in bullet points and quarterly goals. Maybe it was time for something real. That night, Scott sat on the porch with a beer, listening to crickets and Mark's stories about sailors who could drink a battleship dry. For the first time in years, Scott felt lighter. He didn't know what came next, but he knew this was where he needed to be. And somewhere in the back of his mind, where memories of chocolate milk arguments and shared secrets lived, was Marcy Summers. His best friend. His constant. The one person who'd always been there. Scott smiled into the dark. Maybe it was time to see her again. Chapter 2. Welcome home. Trouble. Scott Benson had barely finished his second cup of coffee when Mark ambled into the kitchen wearing a grin that meant trouble. The kind of grin that usually preceded phrases like, don't ask questions, just hold the ladder, or if anyone calls, we were never here. Scott eyed him warily. What? Mark poured himself coffee like a man who had all the time in the world. Marcy's coming by. Scott froze mid-sip. Marcy Summers? Mark gave him a look. Do you know any other Marcy who can tolerate you? Scott set his mug down carefully. Why is she coming here? Because I invited her, Mark said, as if that explained everything. She's bringing Lisa. Scott's pulse did a weird little skip. He hadn't seen Marcy in person for, what, 2 years? Maybe 3? Sure, they texted, called occasionally, but life had a way of turning best friends forever into best friends when schedules allow. And now she was coming here. To this house. Today. Why? Scott asked again, because apparently his vocabulary had shrunk to one word. Mark shrugged. Because I told her you're back in town, and she said, about time. Then she said she's bringing pie. Scott groaned. Pie? That's a trap. Mark grinned wider. Son, if pie is a trap, I hope they never let me out. By the time the doorbell rang, Scott had changed his shirt twice and cursed himself for caring. He opened the door, and there she was, Marcy Summers, in jeans and a soft green sweater, hair pulled back in a messy bun that somehow looked like a deliberate fashion statement. She was holding a pie tin and smiling like she owned the porch. Scott Benson, she said, her voice warm and teasing. Look at you, all grown up and back where you belong. Scott managed a grin. Marcy Summers. Still bossy, I see. Someone has to keep you in line. She stepped forward and hugged him, and for a second, Scott forgot how to breathe. She smelled like vanilla and autumn air, and when she pulled back, he felt like he'd been hit with a nostalgia truck. Before he could say anything, a whirlwind named Lisa burst in from behind her. 10 years old, ponytail swinging, eyes bright with mischief. Uncle Scott, she squealed, launching herself at him like a missile. Scott caught her, laughing. Hey, kiddo, you've grown. Lisa grinned. I'm practically an adult now. Sure, Scott said. An adult who still owes me a rematch in Mario Kart. Lisa's eyes narrowed. You cheated last time. I used strategy, Scott corrected. You used banana peels, Lisa shot back. Mark appeared in the doorway, chuckling. Banana peels are a sailor's best friend. Marcy rolled her eyes. Don't encourage them. They settled in the kitchen, pie on the counter, coffee brewing. The conversation flowed like it always did. Easy, familiar, with just enough sarcasm to keep things interesting. So, Marcy said, slicing the pie, what's the plan? You back for good, or just visiting? Scott shrugged. For now, I'm helping Grandpa with the house. Taking some time to figure things out. Marcy raised an eyebrow. Figure things out? That sounds suspiciously like a midlife crisis. Scott smirked. I'm 34. That's not midlife. Depends on your diet, Marcy said sweetly. Mark snorted. She's got you there. Scott shot him a look. Whose side are you on? The side with pie, Mark said, already reaching for a slice. Later, while Lisa and Mark debated the merits of fake cobwebs for Halloween decorations, Scott and Marcy found themselves on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The air was crisp, the kind that hinted at pumpkins and sweaters and everything Scott had missed while buried in city life. So, Marcy said, leaning against the railing, what really brought you back? Scott hesitated. Honestly, I needed a reset. Work was good, but it felt like I was running on autopilot. I wanted something real. Marcy studied him for a moment, her expression softening. I get that. Scott smiled. You always do. For a heartbeat, the air between them shifted. Something unspoken, something that had always been there, humming quietly beneath the surface. Scott felt it like static on his skin, and judging by the way Marcy looked away, she felt it too. Then Lisa burst out the door, holding a plastic skeleton. We're making this place spooky. Uncle Scott, you're in charge of the graveyard. Scott blinked. Graveyard? Mark grinned like a man who'd just won the lottery. Lisa volunteered us for the school's haunted house fundraiser. And by US, I mean you. Scott groaned. Of course she did. Marcy laughed, and the sound was like sunlight breaking through clouds. Welcome home, Trouble. Scott looked at her, really looked at her, and thought, maybe Trouble isn't so bad. Chapter 3. Graveyard Shift. Scott Benson had faced marketing deadlines, client meltdowns, and one terrifying office karaoke night. But nothing prepared him for the sight of his grandfather wearing a Dracula cape at 9 in the morning. Mark swept into the kitchen like a man auditioning for a low-budget horror flick. The cape billowed dramatically, snagging on a chair leg, which he kicked free with the grace of a retired sailor who'd fought bigger battles than furniture. Morning, Scott said deadpan. Nice ensemble. Mark bared plastic fangs. I vant to drink your coffee. Scott slid his mug across the counter. Knock yourself out, Count Chocula. Mark grinned. Fangs ask you. Lisa says we need commitment. Atmosphere. I'm just doing my part. Scott groaned. Lisa's 10. Her idea of atmosphere is glitter and fake blood. Fake blood's expensive, Mark said. We're using ketchup. Scott pinched the bridge of his nose. Why did I agree to this? Because you're a sucker for that kid, Mark said cheerfully. And because Marcy will be here any minute. Scott froze. Marcy's coming? Mark smirked. She's in charge of the snack booth. You're in charge of the graveyard. Try not to bury yourself. By the time Marcy arrived, Scott had dragged 3 hay bales into the front yard and was contemplating his life choices. She stepped out of her car carrying a box of cookies and wearing a scarf that made her look like autumn personified. Scott's brain short-circuited for a second. Hey, gravedigger, she called, grinning. Need a hand? Scott wiped sweat from his forehead. Only if you're volunteering for manual labor. Marcy set down the box. I brought sugar. That's emotional labor. Scott smirked. I'll allow it. Lisa bounded out of the house, plastic skeleton in tow. Uncle Scott. Mom. Grandpa says we need more tombstones. Scott eyed the skeleton. What's his name? Lisa looked offended. Sir Bones a lot. Scott nodded solemnly. A distinguished gentleman. Mark appeared behind her, still in his cape, now holding a rubber bat. We're making this place legendary, Scott muttered, or a crime scene. The next 3 hours were chaos wrapped in cobwebs. Scott hammered plywood tombstones while Marcy painted witty epitaphs like "Here lies homework" and "RIP Wi-Fi." Lisa supervised with the authority of a tiny general, issuing orders like, "More fog. Spookier music. Uncle Scott, your zombie impression is weak." Scott groaned. "I'm not doing zombie impressions." Marcy grinned. "Come on. For the kids." "For the kids," Scott repeated, deadpan, then staggered across the yard groaning. "Brands." Lisa clapped. "Better. Still needs work." Mark leaned on a rake, smirking. "You look like me after chilly night." Scott shot him a look. Helpful. When the sun dipped low, the yard looked like a Tim Burton fever dream. Tombstones, skeletons, cobwebs, and a fog machine that Mark had borrowed from the VFW hall. The turret loomed above like a haunted castle, and Scott had to admit, it was impressive. Marcy stood beside him, surveying their handiwork. "Not bad, Benson. You might have a future in spooky landscaping." Scott grinned. "Finally, a career path." Marcy laughed, and Scott felt that familiar tug in his chest, the one he'd been ignoring since kindergarten. She looked at him then, really looked, and for a second, the world narrowed to her smile and the way the fading light caught in her hair. Then Lisa yelled from the porch, "Mom! Uncle Scott! Grandpa says the fog machine's possessed." Scott sighed. "Of course it is." They found Mark poking the fog machine with a broom like it owed him money. "Things belching like a sailor on shore leave," he grumbled. Scott unplugged it. "Problem solved." Mark eyed him. "You're no fun." Scott smirked. "I'm practical." Marcy leaned against the railing, amused. "You two are like a sitcom." Mark grinned. "He's the straight man. I'm the comic relief." Scott muttered, "More like the chaos generator." Later, after Lisa went inside to plot more decorations and Mark disappeared to test the candy supply, Scott and Marcy lingered on the porch again. The air was cool, scented with leaves and distant bonfires. Scott felt like he was standing on the edge of something. Something big, something terrifying, something he wanted more than he'd ever admit. "You've changed," Marcy said softly. Scott glanced at her. "Good changed or bad changed?" "Good," she said, smiling. "You seem lighter." Scott shrugged. "Maybe I finally stopped running." Marcy's eyes held his, warm and steady. "I'm glad you're here." Scott swallowed hard. "Me too." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Lisa's voice shattered the quiet. "Mom. Uncle Scott. Grandpa says we need more ketchup blood." Marcy laughed, and Scott did too, because if there was one thing guaranteed in life, it was that Lisa and Mark would never let things get too serious. As Scott followed Marcy inside, he thought, "Graveyard shift isn't so bad, if she's on it with me." Chapter 4. Sparks and Skeletons. The haunted house fundraiser was officially underway, and Scott Benson was questioning every life choice that had led him to this moment, standing in a fog-filled yard, wearing a zombie mask, while his grandfather lurked behind a bush in full Dracula regalia. More groaning. Lisa hissed from the shadows like a pint-sized director. "You're supposed to sound undead, Uncle Scott." Scott groaned theatrically. "Brains." Lisa frowned. "You sound like you need a chiropractor." Scott yanked off the mask. "I'm a marketing guy, not a method actor." Marcy appeared beside him, carrying a tray of caramel apples and looking annoyingly perfect in a witch hat. "You're doing great," she said, grinning. "Very stiff." Scott smirked. "Thanks for the glowing review." "Anytime," Marcy said, eyes twinkling. "Now put the mask back on. You're scaring no one." Scott muttered something about occupational hazards and obeyed, mostly because Marcy's smile could make him agree to just about anything. The yard was packed with kids shrieking, parents laughing, and Mark dramatically sweeping his cape like he was auditioning for Dracula, the musical. The turret loomed above, draped in fake cobwebs, and the fog machine belched mist like a dragon with indigestion. Scott and Marcy worked side by side, guiding kids through the graveyard maze. Every time their hands brushed, passing a flashlight, adjusting a tombstone, Scott felt a jolt like static electricity. He told himself it was nothing. He lied. "You okay?" Marcy asked at one point, tilting her head. Scott nodded too quickly. "Fine. Great. Loving the ambience." Marcy smiled knowingly. "You always were a terrible liar." Scott opened his mouth to retort, but Lisa appeared, dragging a skeleton on a skateboard. "Sir Bones a lot is making his grand entrance." Scott blinked. "Why is he on wheels?" "Because drama," Lisa said, as if that explained everything. Mark clapped his hands. "That's my girl. Showbiz runs in the family." Scott muttered, "Pretty sure chaos runs in the family." Halfway through the night, Scott found himself in the snack booth with Marcy, refilling cider cups while Mark entertained a crowd with Navy ghost stories. Marcy laughed at something Lisa said, and Scott caught himself staring at the curve of her smile, the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, the little strand of hair escaping her bun. "You're staring," Marcy said without looking at him. Scott blinked. "What?" "No, I was monitoring the cider levels." Marcy smirked. "Sure." Scott felt his ears burn. "You've gotten Bozier." "You've gotten rustier," she shot back, handing him a tray. "Go deliver these before I revoke your zombie license." Scott grinned despite himself. "Yes, ma'am." Later, when the crowd thinned and the fog machine finally gave up the ghost, literally, Scott and Marcy ended up on the porch again, watching Lisa chase Mark around the yard with a rubber bat. The night air was cool, scented with caramel and laughter. Scott felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "You did good tonight," Marcy said softly. Scott shrugged. "Team effort." Marcy looked at him, her expression warm and a little wistful. "It's nice seeing you here again." Scott swallowed hard. "It's nice being here." For a moment, the world narrowed to her eyes, her smile, the way the porch light haloed her hair. Scott wanted to say something, anything, but words tangled in his throat. Then Lisa barreled up the steps, breathless. "Mom, Uncle Scott. Grandpa says he's starting a conga line." Marcy laughed, and Scott did too, because of course Mark was starting a conga line. And maybe that was okay. Maybe life didn't need grand declarations, just moments like this, messy and perfect. As Scott followed Marcy inside, he thought, if sparks and skeletons are the price of admission, I'll pay it gladly. Chapter 5. The Park Confession. Saturday afternoon in Benson Park was the kind of autumn postcard people posted online with captions like #blessed. Golden leaves drifted lazily from towering oaks. Kids shrieked on the playground, and Scott Benson was wondering if he'd accidentally signed up for an intervention. Because Lisa Summers, 10 years old, ponytail swinging like a metronome of judgment, was marching ahead with the determination of a general leading troops into battle. Behind her, Scott and Marcy trailed like guilty defendants on their way to sentencing. "Lisa," Marcy called, trying to keep up. "Slow down." "No," Lisa said without turning. "You two need to talk." Scott exchanged a glance with Marcy. "Should we be worried?" Marcy sighed. "Probably." They reached the park bench near the duck pond, where Lisa spun around dramatically, hands on hips. "Sit." Scott blinked. "Excuse me." "Sit," Lisa repeated, pointing at the bench like a tiny Supreme Court judge. "Now." Scott sat. Marcy sat. Lisa paced in front of them, muttering under her breath like she was rehearsing a TED Talk. Finally, she stopped, faced them, and unleashed the fury. "You two are exhausting." Scott blinked. "What? Exhausting?" Lisa said, enunciating every syllable. "Do you know how many years I've watched you dance around each other like awkward penguins? My entire life." Marcy opened her mouth. "Lisa." "No," Lisa said, holding up a hand. "You don't get to talk yet." "I'm talking." Scott bit back a laugh. "Okay." Lisa pointed at Scott. "You love her." Scott's brain short-circuited. "I what?" Lisa pointed at Marcy. "You love him." Marcy's jaw dropped. "Lisa." Lisa threw her hands up. "Everyone knows it. Grandpa knows it. The mailman probably knows it. The only people who don't seem to know it are you two." Scott stared at Marcy. Marcy stared at Scott. The air between them crackled like static. Lisa crossed her arms. "You're supposed to be the adults here. Start acting like it." Scott opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Lisa, it's complicated." "No, it's not," Lisa said. "You love each other. You're both single. You hang out all the time. You laugh at each other's dumb jokes. It's literally the plot of every rom-com ever." Marcy groaned. "Lisa." Lisa held up a finger. "Don't Lisa me. I'm 10. I have better emotional intelligence than both of you combined." Scott rubbed the back of his neck. "She's not wrong." Marcy shot him a look. "You're agreeing with her?" Scott shrugged helplessly. "She makes a compelling argument." Lisa threw her arms wide. "Thank you. Finally. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to get ice cream with Grandpa while you two figure out your lives." And with that, she spun on her heel and marched off toward the snack stand, where Mark was waiting with a grin that could power a small city. Scott and Marcy sat in stunned silence. For a long moment, neither spoke. Ducks quacked in the pond. A breeze rustled the leaves. Somewhere in the distance, Mark and Lisa were probably high-fiving. Finally, Marcy laughed. A short, incredulous laugh that broke the tension like a pin popping a balloon. "Well, that happened." Scott smiled weakly. "She's a thorough." Marcy shook her head, still laughing. "I can't believe she just called us out." Scott said. "Yeah." Brutally. Marcy sobered, her gaze dropping to her hands. "She's not wrong, though." Scott's heart thudded. "No," he said quietly. "She's not." Marcy looked up, and for the first time in years, Scott saw everything he'd been afraid to see. Hope, fear, longing, all tangled together. It hit him like a wave. "I've loved you for a long time," Scott said before he could stop himself. Marcy blinked. "Scott, I didn't say anything because..." He swallowed hard. "Because I was scared. Scared of losing you. Scared of messing up the one thing that's always been good in my life." Marcy's eyes shimmered. "You think I wasn't scared too?" Scott stared. I've loved you since kindergarten," Marcy said, her voice trembling with laughter and tears. "Over chocolate milk, for crying out loud." Scott laughed, because of course it started with chocolate milk. "So we've both been idiots. World-class idiots," Marcy agreed. Scott reached for her hand, and when their fingers intertwined, it felt like coming home. Simple, right? Inevitable. "So," Scott said, smiling. "What now?" Marcy squeezed his hand. "Now we stop being exhausting." Scott grinned. "Deal." Across the park, Mark watched them from the snack stand, Lisa beside him with an ice cream cone and a smug expression. "Told you," Lisa said. Mark chuckled. "Kid, you're a Benson at heart." Lisa grinned. "Does that mean I get a Navy flag too?" Mark winked. One day, as Scott and Marcy walked back toward them, hand in hand, Scott felt lighter than he had in years. No more running. No more hiding. Just love. Messy, terrifying, wonderful love. And maybe, just maybe, Lisa was right. It really was that simple. Chapter 6. Autumn and after. The first frost kissed the edges of Benson's yard like powdered sugar on a pastry. Scott stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the morning sun turn the turret's flag into a blaze of red, white, and blue. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about deadlines or quarterly reports. He was thinking about pumpkins, firewood, and the woman humming in the kitchen. Marcy Summers. She'd come over early to help Lisa carve jack-o'-lanterns, but Scott suspected help was code for supervise while Lisa turns the porch into a pumpkin crime scene. He grinned at the thought and stepped inside. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and chaos. Lisa was elbow deep in pumpkin guts, wearing an apron that read queen of everything. Marcy stood beside her, laughing as she tried to rescue a rogue seed from Lisa's hair. You're supposed to carve the pumpkin, Marcy said, amused. Not wrestle it. Lisa grinned. It started it. Scott leaned against the doorway. Looks like a crime of passion. Marcy glanced up, and Scott's heart did that ridiculous flip it had been doing ever since the park confession. She smiled, soft, warm, the kind of smile that made him want to freeze time. Morning, she said. Morning, Scott replied, trying to sound casual and failing spectacularly. Lisa rolled her eyes. You two are gross. Scott smirked. You started this. Lisa pointed a gooey finger at him. And I'll finish it. Happily ever after or bust. Marcy laughed, and Scott did too, because Lisa wasn't wrong. Not anymore. By noon, the porch looked like a pumpkin art gallery, some spooky, some silly, one that Lisa insisted was abstract. Mark wandered out, wearing his navy cap and carrying a rake like a scepter. Looks good, he said, surveying the pumpkins. Almost makes up for the haunted house fog machine fiasco. Scott groaned. We agreed never to speak of that again. Mark grinned. Where's the fun in that? Lisa piped up. Grandpa, can we make caramel apples? Mark winked. Kid, you read my mind. As they headed inside, Scott lingered on the porch with Marcy. The air was crisp, the yard scattered with leaves, and for a moment, it felt like the world had slowed down just for them. You happy? Marcy asked softly. Scott looked at her, really looked, and smiled. Yeah, happier than I've been in a long time. Marcy's eyes softened. Me too. Scott reached for her hand, and when their fingers intertwined, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. That evening, after Lisa declared herself CEO of Operation Cozy Fall, and Mark fell asleep in his recliner mid-story, Scott and Marcy curled up on the porch swing with mugs of cider. The stars glittered above, and the sound of crickets filled the quiet. So, Marcy said, leaning against him, what's next for you? Scott exhaled slowly. Honestly, I don't know. I've been thinking about starting my own thing, consulting, maybe. Something flexible. Something that leaves room for this. He squeezed her hand gently. Marcy smiled. I like the sound of that. Scott grinned. You'd make a great business partner. Marcy raised an eyebrow. Is that a proposal? Scott smirked. One step at a time. Inside, Lisa peeked through the window, grinning like a cat with cream. They're holding hands, she whispered to Mark, who cracked one eye open and smiled. Mission accomplished, he murmured. Lisa beamed. Best team ever. As the night deepened and the porch swing creaked softly beneath them, Scott realized something. He'd come home looking for purpose. He'd found it. In laughter, in love, in the family that had always been there, waiting. Autumn had never felt so good. Epilogue. A Benson Christmas. Snowflakes drifted lazily past the turret windows, frosting the wraparound porch like a gingerbread house. Inside, the Benson home was a riot of twinkling lights, garlands, and enough holiday cheer to make a Hallmark movie blush. Scott Benson stood in the living room, staring at his grandfather in disbelief. You're wearing the beard. Mark grinned beneath a fluffy white Santa beard that looked like it had been wrestled off a polar bear. Kid, when you commit, you commit. Scott shook his head. You're 71. Santa's older. Mark shot back, adjusting his red hat with the swagger of a man who'd survived typhoons and Navy cooks. Now hand me that sack of presents before Lisa stages a coup. As if on cue, Lisa burst in wearing reindeer antlers and a glittery sweater that read CEO of Christmas. Grandpa, you're late for the photo op. Mark winked at Scott. See? She's running this operation like a five-star admiral. Scott laughed, because it was true. Lisa had orchestrated the entire holiday like a military campaign. Tree trimming, cookie baking, even a playlist titled Festive or Else. And Scott loved every second of it. Especially because Marcy was here. Always here now. She appeared in the doorway carrying a tray of hot cocoa, her cheeks pink from the cold, her smile warm enough to melt snow. Scott's heart did that ridiculous flip it had been doing for months, and he didn't even try to hide it anymore. Cocoa delivery, she announced, setting the tray down. Extra marshmallows for the boss. She handed a mug to Lisa, who accepted it like a queen receiving tribute. Scott grinned. What about me? Marcy smirked. You get one marshmallow. For effort. Scott leaned closer, lowering his voice. What do I get for charm? Marcy's eyes sparkled. Try harder. The evening unfolded in a blur of laughter and chaos. Mark reading, "'Twas the night before Christmas" in a dramatic baritone. Lisa insisting on a TikTok dance with Santa, and Scott sneaking extra marshmallows when Marcy wasn't looking. But beneath the noise and glitter, Scott felt something steady, something real. This was home. Not just the house, but the people, the family he'd built from love and stubborn loyalty. And tonight, he was going to make it official. After the presents were opened and Lisa declared herself president of Holiday Spirit, Scott slipped out to the porch, heart pounding like a drumline. The snow crunched under his boots, the air crisp and sharp. He reached into his pocket, fingers closing around the small velvet box. Marcy joined him a moment later, wrapping her scarf tighter. Escaping the chaos? Scott smiled. Just taking a minute. She stepped beside him, her breath misting in the cold. It's beautiful out here. Scott nodded, but he wasn't looking at the snow. He was looking at her, the woman who'd been his best friend, his anchor, his everything. The woman he'd been too scared to lose, until he realized he couldn't live without her. Marcy, he said softly. She turned, and when their eyes met, Scott forgot how to breathe. Yeah. He pulled out the box, flipped it open, and held his breath as her eyes widened. Marcy Summers, he said, voice steady despite the storm in his chest. Will you marry me? For a heartbeat, the world went still, snow falling, lights twinkling, his heart hanging on her answer. Then she laughed, a bright, beautiful laugh that wrapped around him like warmth, and said, About time, Benson. Scott grinned, relief flooding him as she threw her arms around his neck. Is that a yes? It's the biggest yes, she whispered, kissing him like the answer had been waiting for decades. Inside, Lisa peeked through the window, eyes wide. Grandpa, they're kissing. Mark grinned, stroking his beard. Mission accomplished. Lisa pumped a fist. Best Christmas ever. As Scott held Marcy close, snow swirling around them like confetti, he thought, this is it. The missing piece. The happily ever after I didn't believe in, until now. And for the first time in his life, Scott Benson wasn't running. He was home. Forever.